You need me to say it again, louder this time? I want you to cough so I can ascertain just how much of your intestines are now protruding into your groin now that I got you by the balls. This is Bedtime Stories, Grown-Up Edition, Resurrection, Part 20. If you're one of them weird people who like to look at the background of the videos and you notice that I got on the same pajamas in multiple videos, that's because I'm recording these joints back to back. Now, it might take me some time to edit it, but... And yes, I still run errands in my pajamas. I ain't getting out the car. Sometimes it bees like that. Mind your business. Anyway, when we left off, we had learned a whole lot about anteaters and the extremely complex and intricate attack that the 5 families had leveled against the International Trafficking Organization was coming to a head. Okay, so if you are confused at all, let me clear a couple things up before we move forward. I'm even going to include an org chart. All right, so here we go. There were 4 people at the head of the International Trafficking Organization, one of whom was Jerry Rouse, who's in federal custody. The identities of 2 of the other leaders were uncovered as a result of their foolish decision to target the daughter of the chief of the Denton Police Department. That resulted in a whole lot of dots being connected and Q engaging multiple attacks with the Briggs organization at the center of them all. He'd used the traffickers' own way of operating against them. He'd forced the hand of the very organization that they'd hired to go after his sister-in-law, Stephanie, her 2-year-old daughter, and her husband to back the heads of the organizations in multiple corners. And then he let an anteater loose to wreak havoc all up and through their underground network. That anteater wasn't just focused on getting Tamara released. The anteater was a part of an intricate plot to get the 3 remaining heads to flip on one another, and most importantly, to identify the last one, because he was technically the head honcho. With all of the leaders taken down and their entire operation exposed, Q's plan was to get rid of the organization once and for all. He knew that they weren't the only traffickers out there, that he was not going to solve the world's trafficking problem. But the organization who turned Big Wood and his family's lives upside down would absolutely be providing the news media and the government with lots of reasons to pay out overtime. And the anteater was probably going to be able to name his price on the underground hacking market. He'd have his pick of jobs. He'd be able to choose between employment at a government agency, contract work with the 5 families, or independent work like the work done by that group, Anonymous. And since 2 could keep a secret when 1 is dead, he wouldn't even have to worry about being identified if he chose that route, because he had proven that he was good all by himself. He ain't need a crew, and he ain't need no backing. He was a man who could stand on his own too, and Q loved that for him. Nobody would have ever guessed that the traffickers would be foolish enough to kidnap Tamara themselves. And they certainly wouldn't have guessed that of all the women in the world, and all the women in New York, that Sincere would get romantically involved with the daughter of a man involved in trafficking. But you know what they say, like attracts like. And it's not easy to shake the generational curses associated with your bloodline. It's not impossible. People do it every day. But it's certainly not easy. So Sincere, whose grandfather was a certified predator himself, and his father was a documented philanderer, was absolutely attracted to a woman who shared his criminal and immoral proclivities. If it was up to him, he would have kept Amber on the team. He would have married Natalia, been crowned kingpin, and continued his salacious activities on the side, because Amber was right up his alley. Of all the things that she had shared with Bosch while they were in captivity, she'd been foolish enough to share that she and Sincere hadn't taken advantage of one woman, like Sincere had told Catherine. They'd made a game of identifying women, bringing them back to be thirds, and giving them a little something to make them more comfortable. While Amber didn't know exactly what her father was into, she'd admitted that she was the one who was supplying the rugs. Compared to Amber, Sincere was an amateur, and Amber's deviance ran in her blood. She'd also shared that her father was significantly older than her mother, and the only reason why her family hadn't put Donald Green up under the jail was because not only was her mother pregnant with her, but he'd given them a large sum of money in exchange for their daughter's hand in marriage. That man had married a 15-year-old girl when he was 35 years old, and they'd been married for 25 years. She'd also told Bosch that her now 40-year-old mother had been over her father, so much so that she'd been caught with her hands in the younger, browner cookie jar, and that was the source of her father's disdain for black men. He ain't seemed to have no problem with black women, though, because he'd been caught with his hands in that cookie jar. Amber didn't know that her father was a part of the trafficking network, but before she had ever even identified him while in captivity, he was already on Q's radar. as a result of Tamara being snatched, and the work that Q had done to connect Tamara's father with criminal activity. Amber's father's identity as one of the heads of the trafficking organization was revealed because of Bosch's efforts in New York after he'd escaped his pretend kidnapping. When Amber had confessed that she was the one who supplied the rugs, Bosch had got her to tell him where she got them from. And when she shared that she'd gotten them from her father's most trusted employee, his chief of operations in the import-export business, Bosch knew that Q's suspicions were correct. And the minute Bosch provided all of the names that Amber had dropped, Q had quickly and efficiently identified some very questionable customs manifests and financial documents that supported the assumption that Amber's father, Donald Green, was involved in trafficking, and the chief of police was his connect in Texas, making his smuggling of humans possible. Bosch had proven the connection when he'd entrapped Donald Green's right hand, and the Anteater had uncovered Johnny Decker's role as another one of the heads of the International Trafficking Organization as a result of his efforts to find Tamara. If any of the plans that were actively in play worked the way Q intended, either the trafficker's lieutenant, who'd been kidnapped in Puerto Rico, or Johnny Decker, whose servers had been infiltrated, or Donald Green, whose daughter had been snatched, would lead Q directly to the head honcho. One of them were gonna name him. As hot as Q had made the block, it could absolutely get hotter. So stay with me now. Jerry Rouse was the reason why the head honcho had gone after Melissa and Michael. Johnny Decker's lieutenant was the one who'd engaged Danny Briggs to kidnap Stephanie, Baby Kari, and Pastor CT. Danny Green was the one with the connections to the chief and the politician in Texas. And Johnny Decker used his own men to kidnap Tamara in order to ensure that she would be unharmed, and because he and the head honcho were in agreement that doing so would absolutely lure out Q by enraging Michael. He'd do something stupid, get caught slipping, and they'd have home court advantage again. Q orchestrated the kidnapping of Amber to appear as retaliation for the kidnapping of Danny Briggs's wife and daughters. And soon enough, the Anteater is going to ensure that Donald Green walks away believing that his daughter's kidnapping is an inside job. In Houston, the Anteater was sitting inside the office of Johnny Decker. Johnny was still refusing to believe that this boy was actually the hacker using the moniker him. Johnny said, "Who's really behind this, young man? And what kind of game are you all playing?" The Anteater said, "I am him, and this is my game. I'm playing the game you started. I'm just better at it." The Anteater had done what Anteaters do. He'd followed the trail. Throughout the entire war between the five families and the traffickers, five families had not only taken out or taken down members of the trafficking organization and employees of the organizations that they employed, they'd also taken all of their technology. So they had the financials and the documentation belonging to the Jamaicans in New York, the mercenaries in Texas, the rival organization in Miami that kidnapped Simone and Star thinking she was Chantal, and the Briggs organization. And the Anteater had found the common denominator. Digging through their financials, he was able to easily track the payments from the trafficking organization to each of those organizations. And from there, he was able to trace those payments back to accounts that were owned by the traffickers and or their associates. We all know what infighting does. It results in people making decisions without having the full backing of their partners. And that's precisely what happened with the traffickers. Donald Green was against going after Stephanie and her family and the chief of police's daughter, Tamara. So the head honcho and Decker had to go rogue. The biggest mistake they made was having the payments to Danny Briggs come directly from the accounts of Johnny Decker, with free reign over the Briggs organization's financials. The Anteater had no problem finding Johnny Decker, his company, and hacking into his system. He tapped into their fleet location tracking system too. Went back to the day that Tamara was snatched and was able to see that multiple vehicles in the Decker fleet had converged on the same location. And Samuel was able to quickly verify that the Decker organization was in fact holding someone at that location. And with the way that their men were moving around the facility, it was clear that it was not being used for their usual trafficking. They had a high-profile individual in their clutches, and it could only be Tamara. Positive that he'd hit pay dirt, the Anteater went to work. He froze the Decker organization's assets, transferred over $2 million of their money into offshore untraceable accounts, and demanded that meeting. And while the hacker and Decker went back and forth, Decker's security breached his office door. When the guards ran in, Decker told them to grab the young boy. Not to hurt him, but to tie him up and hold him until whomever was really behind the hacking came looking for him. But before they could carry that order out, Decker found out that the young boy was really about that life. He flipped one of the guards and punched the other one in the throat, then returned to the first one and snapped his neck, killing him instantly. Then he sat back down in the chair and started reciting 10-digit numbers. By the time he got the third set of 10-digit numbers out, more security rushed in. When they grabbed him, he didn't even resist. He'd already shown what he was capable of, and the look on Decker's face said that he recognized those 10-digit numbers. He quickly told his security to stop and to leave, because while he still didn't believe that the young boy was him, it was clear that he was somebody, and he had severely underestimated him. He looked at him and said, "What do you want?" And the anteater said, "Right now, I just want you to cough." Decker said, I don't have time for these games. He grabbed his desk phone and went to call out, and it didn't work. Then he grabbed his cell phone and tried to use it, and it didn't work either. He was trying to call one of those 10-digit numbers that Michael had recited, because one belonged to his mother, the other belonged to the mother of his son, and the other belonged to the assisted living facility where his grandmother lived. He was even more confused and more convinced that the young man in front of him was definitely not him, because he hadn't seen him do anything to disable the phones. They were working a few minutes before. Before he could ask the young man another question, the anteater pulled a cell phone out of his pocket, sat it on the desk and said, "The only call you need to make is to your homeboy in New York." Then he recited Donald Green's cell phone number, and Decker knew he was up a creek without a paddle. So he decided to play along. He said, "So, you're him. What's that, a play on words? I've heard that y'all YNs have taken to calling yourselves him nowadays." The anteater said, "I'm young, but I'm a man, not a nigga. And I'm both. I'm him and him. Huic electi mondo." Latin meaning, "To this I've chosen to commit." The anteater continued saying, "While it's clear that I'm perfectly capable of killing a man, I've chosen to use my talents for good and not for evil." Decker said, "What do you want?" The anteater said, "I told you, your memory is going out with your old age just like your hearing. You need me to say it again, louder this time? I want you to cough." Decker said, "For what?" The anteater said, "So I can ascertain just how much of your intestines are now protruding into your groin now that I got you by the balls." So Decker coughed, and the anteater laughed in his face. Decker got beat red, and the anteater said, "If you ever want to see your money again, if you want to keep your people and your secrets safe, you'll let my girl walk out of your safe house unharmed. You'll give up the person who convinced you to make that mistake, and you'll call your boy and tell him what I want you to on speaker." And then Decker knew that their plan to lure out Q's son Michael had worked. The young man sitting in front of him was not only Michael, but he was him. Meanwhile, in New York, Bosch had convinced Donald Green to arrange for him to meet his wife. Since Andre had refused to agree to being blindfolded, Donald Green had agreed to talk to his wife, get her to pull herself together long enough to go and meet Andre. Instead of meeting at their home, they would meet at one of his warehouses, where he stored the artifacts that he imported and exported. A warehouse that Bosch knew was under 24-hour surveillance. He knew Donald Green would try to listen into his conversation with his wife, but he also knew that something was going to throw a monkey wrench in that plan. So Bosch wasn't at all surprised when Donald Green's phone rang, or when he answered and put the call on hold, and told him to head back to the condo and wait to hear from him. When Andre left his office, Donald Green returned to his phone call. He said, "What you got for me, Johnny?" And then he listened while Johnny Decker, one of his oldest friends and one of his partners in crime, weaved a tale that left him hotter than fish grease. Johnny said, "Listen, man, and before you say anything, please, just hear me out. You don't even have to say you told me so, because I know that. I'm in a terrible situation and I need your help. And I know that you're in a situation and you can use mine." And then he used code to tell his friend that the head honcho had orchestrated the kidnapping of Danny Briggs' wife and children in order to force him to kidnap Tamara. Because of Tamara's connection to Q's son, Q was willing to move heaven and earth to discover who was behind it and keep his son from inserting himself in it. He'd gained Chief Camp's trust and got him to tell him about his relationship with Donald Green. Q had convinced him not to make any attempts to rescue his daughter from Danny Briggs' clutches, because Danny Briggs would do anything to get his own wife and children back, including hurting Camp's daughter if he thought that the jig was up. Still using code, he told him that neither Camp, Hill, or the head honcho could be trusted. Briggs not only had Tamara, he also had DeAndre and Amber, and the head honcho was willing to sacrifice his daughter and his relationship with Donald Green to make Green look like he was the one behind the kids' kidnappings so that he could maintain a relationship with the chief and the politician, keep Briggs from discovering that he was the one responsible for his wife and daughter's kidnapping, and let Donald Green take the fall for it all. Donald Green said, "Why in the hell are you telling me all this?" And Johnny Decker, following the playbook that Michael had provided him, said, "'Cause I'm the one who paid the man. And now them boys got my money tied up, and I refuse to go down with them." He wanted Green to believe that he'd paid Briggs on the head honcho's behalf. Somehow the feds figured that out and froze his accounts. He made no mention of him. And he certainly didn't tell him that he was in full agreement with the head honcho's plan and he was the one who had kidnapped Tamara, or that he had no idea who had taken DeAndre. It was all gonna fall in Briggs's lap by way of the head honcho. And that one phone call was about to bring down all three of them. To put the nail in the coffin, Johnny Decker said, "I get why you would want to prove that everything I'm telling you is true. But if you know like I know, you'll go retrieve your goods. It won't take long for them boys to connect the dots. And when they do, they're going to go collect them missing pieces." Referring to Tamara and DeAndre, that man ain't going to have no reason to hold on to your goods any longer. Referring to Briggs keeping Amber alive. Hearing that, Danny Green immediately went into action. He made a plan to get his daughter out of that safe house that night and then headed home so he could talk with his wife. If anything went wrong that night, he was going to need all the help that he could get to keep his wife in her right mind. And at that point, Andre was his best bet. He was going to need that man to establish a rapport with his wife, provide her with encouragement, and talk her off a ledge. Meanwhile, inside the chauffeured car, Andre was bopping his head to the music that he was listening to on his cell phone. But it wasn't actually music. He was listening to the bug that he'd placed inside Donald Green's office. He'd verified that Donald Green had taken the bait. He'd pulled the trigger on Amber's rescue mission, made arrangements for his wife Camille and Andre both to be transported to a house where he usually kept individuals who he'd engaged in the trade so that they could meet, discuss Amber, and Andre could be there to support her while she awaited her daughter's rescue. If all went well, the men who were being sent to rescue her would bring her back to that same house where she'd be reunited with her mother and Andre. She'd get the medical care that she needed, be able to provide her father with the information he needed, and all would be well. But if anything went wrong, Andre would be there to support his wife while he was out making the streets red. But first, he needed to head home and talk to his wife. At the same time, in Houston, Johnny Decker had ended that phone call, looked at him and said, "So now what? You just gonna walk out of here? You just gonna leave me holding the bag and waiting to see what you do next?" Michael said, "Nah, you and I are going to walk out of here together, and we're going to take a little trip." When Johnny Decker said, "I'm not going anywhere with you," Michael said, "You sure about that? You've got a man in Puerto Rico whose pregnant wife is depending on you to save the day. Could you imagine the secrets that man would spill if he found out that the baby he's expecting is actually yours? You're a nasty old man, and with friends like you, who needs enemies?" Meanwhile, in Japan, Sincere had spent the last few days in negotiations with the head of the Tanaka Empire. He'd handled the business like he was an old pro. For the headache that he'd been for the 5 families, he'd certainly shown that the extensive investment his father had made in him to make him a business powerhouse had been worth it. He'd sat across from some of the most powerful men and women in the world, and the fact that he'd had an alternative agenda wasn't even perceptible. Because on the very rare occasions that he'd been able to sit in a room with Suki Tanaka, he'd barely given her a second look. But he had not missed that she'd had a hard time keeping her eyes off of him. And he wasn't at all surprised when their negotiations were just about done and Suki invited him to share a meal. It was go time. He had carried himself like he had no idea just how deep the connections were between his deceased father and Suki Tanaka. And he was going to force the Japanese beauty, who was at least 15 years his senior, to show him exactly what she was made of. He was ready to apply pressure, and Suki was either going to drop the drawers or be completely disgusted by the idea of sleeping with the son of the man who she'd carried on a decades-long affair with, without anybody in her world having a clue. Unlike the other women that Nigel St. James had been cheating on his wife with, Suki had needed his security, but that hadn't stopped him from employing soldiers clear across the world to keep an eye on her and ensure her safety. He'd had a vested interest in protecting their affair and keeping the secrets he'd shared with her safe. So to ensure the safety of the men that he'd put in place, he'd had to inform Suki and she'd had to inform her Tasaka supplied security that the soldiers in the shadows weren't a threat to her. So when Sincere and Saki sat down across from one another for a formal Japanese dinner called a kaiseki, a multi-course meal that included hot water to prepare the digestive system, an appetizer or sakizuki, sashimi or mukozuki, simmered, grilled, and steamed dishes, rice, miso soup, pickled items, and a light dessert, or kanmi, which includes seasonal fruit, sorbet, or a light traditional sweet. Sincere was ready to either woo or discuss Suki, and either one would get her just where he wanted her. Intending to head Sincere off at the pass, Suki started the conversation by saying, "So I understand that you traveled with your fiancé?" Sincere said, "I did." Suki said, "I hope that you plan to bring her to the banquet when our negotiations are concluded." Sincere said, "I'm thinking about it." Suki said, "I can't imagine that she'd travel all of this way, knowing that your negotiations include her family, and she not have a role in ensuring that this deal is secured." Sincere said, "I'm keeping her abreast, keeping her father in the loop. She's a great deal more interested in seeing the sights, running up a bag, and keeping an eye on me." Suki said, "Trouble in paradise?" Sincere said, "Our engagement is more of a business arrangement than anything else. And as of late, we've been having a difficult time seeing eye to eye. If you're concerned about her being an impediment to you and I getting to know one another better, let me assure you that that won't be an issue." Suki said, "I don't know what you mean. It's my preference not to mix business with personal, and I don't make it a habit of getting myself involved with men who are already taken. So if by that you mean," Sincere said, "Come on now. You don't think I've seen how you've been looking at me? You don't think that I'm already familiar with your reputation?" Suki said in her usually clipped English, "It is in your best interest to expound upon that statement if your preference is to leave this dinner alive." Sincere said, Whoa. Be easy. I simply mean that I heard that you have a penchant for black men, for powerful black men. I was led to believe that you don't open yourself up to personal alliances that don't also include business advantages. My research tells me that the only reason why you're a single woman is because the marriage your father arranged for you didn't quite work out. There was some medical information that was uncovered that made a union between you and your fiance no longer a profitable proposition. Or did I hear wrong? Suki said, "You have an advantage. I've been in this business for a long time. A lot of my personal life has unfortunately become common knowledge. Unfortunately, you're a new face at the table. You are also considerably younger than I, so there isn't as much dirt to uncover from your past. My prospects for a husband are limitless. Who I will marry is not a decision that I get to make. Who I will have in my bed is completely up to me, so that there is no confusion. Let me say this to you clearly. I won't be your side, your third, and I am not a woman that you can manipulate. I invited you here to get to know you, beyond the boardroom in the suit, because I am intrigued, but not by you, by how a man that I knew for nearly 2 decades managed to hide a son and the identity of the mother of that son, because I am fully aware of the fact that his wife is barren." Sincere said, "Let me find out you knew my father personally, and based on how you knew him, you figured you knew him well enough to know where he was laying pipe? What exactly was the nature of your relationship with my pops?" And then Suki realized that she'd been walked into a damn trap. So she said, "He was not on the list of men that my father had to choose from in his quest to find me a husband. But he was one of the men who I had chosen to be in my bed. I couldn't have been more shocked than to see his almost splitting image walk into the Tanaka office building. You have your father's smile."
Checkers, better yet, the game don't love nobody. Let's play chess.